This is Stone Cold Export, and in this video we are taking a look at that motherboard. So this is the GIGABYTE X570S Aero G. Sorry, I had to do a voiceover for this unboxing because the microphone I used, there was no battery life left. So a voiceover is what we will do. So this is a white themed board, and we chose this over the N60 B550 mainly because of the extra connectivity you get with X570. The motherboard, as all other motherboards, comes packed in an anti-static bag, and my first impressions were pretty positive. Build quality felt pretty good. And I think the overall look is pretty nice, although the VRM heatsink is more silvery than it is white, but that's a minor complaint, I suppose. I'm also not a huge fan of those blue accents on the motherboard in the Aero logo and the GIGABYTE logo, but depends on what kind of lighting you hold it under. I'm not giving you the finger, I'm just pointing on the M.2 heatsink for the main M.2 slot. Overall, the board feels very good, and the rear I/O is also pretty generous. So now let's take a look at what else is in the box. Now you do get an installation guide, can come in handy. There's some other paperwork here that I can't read. Then there is the manual for the motherboard itself, which will come in handy, and you get a CD with, I don't know what's on the CD because I don't have an optical drive, so I'm not sure who that is for. Also in the box are several M.2 screws, of course, because this motherboard has 4 M.2 slots. Then we have what I think is the speaker, and then there's the Wi-Fi antenna, which is a white and black theme, so it looks pretty good actually. And it's nice to see that you get a proper Wi-Fi antenna. And then there's, I think this is the temperature sensors. So you get 2 of those, and you can hook those up to the motherboard and monitor the temperatures inside your case wherever you put the sensor. Then there's a RGB adapter cable, I think. Then you do get 4 SATA cables, even though the board has 6 SATA ports, but you will probably only be using 4 of them, unless you want to lose one M.2 slot. Then you have the front panel connector, sort of, I don't know what to call it, but you put in all the front panel connectors and then you put the connector itself onto the motherboard. It supposedly makes it easier. And then there's the rest of the M.2 screws. And that's pretty much all you get in the box. So this is a white themed motherboard. Although the VRM heatsinks do appear a bit more silvery than white, if I'm being honest. The Aero logo and the GIGABYTE logo on the motherboard are sort of a holographic look, and they look kind of blue when you open up the box, but in the case, the blue accent, it sort of depends on the lighting that you got, so it doesn't look that blue when it's actually in the case. I would have preferred to see RGB lighting here. So the cool thing about the X570S motherboards are that they have removed the cooling fan that were on the initial X570 boards. So this board has no active cooling, it's all passively cooled, and as you can see, the M.2 slot heatsinks, they also assist in cooling the chipset, at least the 2 lower ones. The main M.2 heatsink is focused on the main M.2 slot. Now let's take a look at the rear I/O. So the rear I/O has 2 USB 2 ports. Then you have the Wi-Fi antennas, and you do get a Wi-Fi antenna bundled in the box, as we saw in the unboxing. Now this is a Wi-Fi 6E on revision 1.1 boards and Wi-Fi 6 on revision 1 boards. And there's an Intel Wi-Fi chip on the revision 1 boards and a MediaTek chip on the revision 1.1 boards. There's a slight difference here because the Intel chip supports channel width of up to 160 MHz, while the MediaTek chip only supports channel width up to 80 MHz. Then we have a DisplayPort in port, more on that a bit later. And then there's a HDMI 2.0 port with support for 4K 60 Hz. Next to that we find 2 Type A ports, and these are both 5 gigabits per second. The lower one is used for QFlash Plus, which is flashing the BIOS without having a CPU or graphics card installed. You can just name the BIOS file a particular thing, hook it up to the USB port and hit the button on the motherboard. Below that we find the Vision Link port. Now this is a USB-C port which GIGABYTE has named the Vision Link. So the Vision Link port supports 60 watts of power, and you can hook this up to something external that requires USB-C power, or a USB-C monitor, or a drawing tablet which you can power through the port. So if you want to use the Vision Link port for a display output, you would first need to use a regular DisplayPort cable from your graphics card to the DisplayPort in on the motherboard, and then you can hook up your monitor to the USB-C port. Or the Vision Link port, so the topmost USB-C port. Now next to that we find two Type A ports, so these are 10 gigabits per second, and below those there is a USB Type C port with support for up to 20 gigabits per second. Then we have the RJ45 port, which uses an Intel i225V NIC, so that's 2.5 gigabits per second. And then you have your audio outputs, which also has optical out and support for DSD audio if you need that, and that uses a ALC 1220 VB audio codec. Now for the onboard headers on the motherboard, this motherboard has a lot of onboard headers. Let's start off with the most important headers, the RGB headers. So it has 4 RGB headers, 2 in the lower left corner and 2 in the top right corner. So in the lower left corner and the top right corner, you find one addressable RGB header and one 12-volt RGB header. So the addressable RGB header, that runs on 5 volts and means you can adjust your individual LEDs, while the 12-volt header means you choose the color for the entire strip, not individual LEDs. Actually, there is 5 RGB headers if you count the one that's next to the CPU socket. And then there is the question of how many fan headers does this board have. This is one of the most common questions that I got asked on the ASRock B550M Pro 4 motherboard review. And this board has, and pay attention, 8 fan headers. I'm going to timestamp this, so I don't expect any questions. This board also has a clear CMOS jumper, no clear CMOS button, which is a bit of a drawback for a board at this price. There are 6 SATA ports on the motherboard, 2 of which share lanes with one M.2 slot. More on that a bit later. We also find 2 USB 2 headers on this motherboard, along with 2 USB 3 5 gigabits per second headers. That's the large blocky connector, that's always a pain. And there's one USB-C header. There's also some Thunderbolt connectivity on the motherboard, but I haven't really gotten around to test that. We also find 2 temperature sensor headers, and you do get the temperature sensors in the box, so you can of course take advantage of this if you feel like it. There's also a noise detection header, which I'm not quite sure how it works. So the debug LEDs are positioned in a very unfortunate place. They are directly below your GPU. So your GPU is going to cover up the debug LEDs, and they are not going to help you debug your computer if you're having an issue. You will need a very short GPU or a CPU with integrated graphics if you are going to take advantage of the debug LEDs. And that's unfortunate. Now let's move on to PCIe Express connectivity. So this board has full PCIe Express 4.0 throughout all the ports, all the PCIe ports, all the M.2 slots. It's all PCIe 4.0, which is very nice. The top full-length slot is connected to the CPU directly, and it supports 16 lanes, which is pretty much typical of all of these top slots. The next full-length slot, that supports 8 lanes and share lanes with the top slot. So if you insert any card in the second PCIe full-length slot, your GPU will run at 8 lanes instead of 16, regardless if the card you insert into that second slot is 1 lane or 4 lanes. Then the bottommost full-length slot supports PCIe 4.0 by 4, so that's 4 lanes, and that shares lanes with one of the M.2 slots. Which brings us on to the M.2 slots. So the top M.2 slot is connected directly to the CPU with its own heatsink, and that runs at PCIe 4.0 by 4, so that's 4 lanes of PCIe 4.0. The middle M.2 slots, so there are 2 M.2 slots behind the white cover in the middle of the motherboard, and both of these slots runs at PCIe 4.0 with 4 lanes. The bottommost of these 2 slots shares lanes with 2 of the SATA connectors, so if you are putting an M.2 SSD into this slot, you will lose 2 SATA connectors. And if you are using all 6 SATA ports or 2 of the lowermost SATA ports, then you will not be able to use this M.2 slot, so keep that in mind. So the bottommost M.2 slot, it's also PCIe 4.0 with 4 lanes, and that shares lanes with the lowest most PCIe slot. So if you are putting in an M.2 slot into the bottommost slot, you will not be able to use the PCIe 4.0 by 4 full-length slot on the motherboard, and vice versa. So keep that in mind when you are figuring out how to set your PC up. Most people probably just use a GPU and no add-in cards, so I don't think a lot of people will be affected by these shared lanes. And you can have a pretty sick M.2 NVMe setup here with 4 PCIe 4.0 by 4 SSDs. So the VRM on this motherboard is very beefy. I tested with a 2700X because yay, it supports 2700X. By the way, important note on the PCIe connectivity stuff. If you are using a 2nd gen Ryzen 2000 series, or any other Ryzen CPU that doesn't support PCIe 4.0, all of your slots will run in PCIe 3.0, not 4.0, so keep that in mind. But anyway, the VRM is very beefy. It's had no issue supplying power to the 2700X, so the B350 Tomahawk motherboard that my girlfriend used before, the VRM on that was pretty much trash for the 2700X and reached 115 degrees Celsius. The VRM on this motherboard, it only reaches like 65 degrees Celsius when I overclock the 2700X, so it should have no issue handling a 5950X at all. So that's a positive note. There is, however, a slight issue with the VRM heatsink. So the VRM heatsink interferes with the CPU mount for the Deepcool AS500 CPU cooler that we are using. So I don't have a lot of other CPU coolers, so I haven't been able to test any others. It should not interfere with the Corsair AIOs because those use the standard AMD mounting mechanism. But other CPU coolers that have brackets on each side of the socket might interfere on the left side with the VRM heatsink. I had to grind off a couple of millimeters, 1 to 2 millimeters tops, to get it to fit. So fitment with some CPU coolers might be an issue because of the VRM heatsink, so keep that in mind as well. Now there is yet another issue with this motherboard, and that is compatibility with Corsair memory. So the Corsair memory will run just fine, speed wise and latency wise there's no issues. It detects all the Corsair memory modules in all slots, but in the third memory slot, not M.2 slot. In the third memory slot, you will not be able to control your RGB lighting on your Corsair memory. I tested this with both my girlfriend's Vengeance RGB Pro memory and my Dominator Platinum RGB memory, and none of those modules showed up in Corsair iCUE. Well, in the third DIMM slot. So when you are using 4 Corsair memory modules, only 3 of them will show up in iCUE. So the memory module in the third slot from the CPU will not show up in Corsair iCUE, and you will not be able to control the RGB on that memory module. A potential workaround is setting up hardware lighting. So in Corsair iCUE you can set up hardware lighting on at least the Dominators and possibly also the Vengeance Pro memory. I haven't tested that. And that is a possible workaround, but every time you want to swap out your lighting or change your lighting, you will have to swap around the memory modules to program the hardware lighting on the memory module that you will not be able to control via iCUE on this motherboard. And that's might be a deal breaker for some, which I completely understand. Now on to some testing. So I tested the networking on this motherboard, both the Wi-Fi and the Ethernet, and the results were interesting. So the first test is the Ethernet test. Now I have a NAS with a 10 gigabit SFP Plus card hooked up to a MikroTik router, which is also SFP Plus. Then we are using a transceiver to RJ45 and up to her computer. The transceiver supports 2.5 gigabits per second, but there could be some potential issues here. When we used iPerf 3, we got a speed of 2.37 gigabits per second from the computer to the NAS. So the NAS was running the iPerf 3 server and the computer was running the client. Then we did a transfer test. We just transferred some files to the server, and I compared this result with the Realtek NIC on the C490 Elite AC motherboard to see if there's any difference between the Realtek and the Intel NIC. And to my surprise, there was. So the Intel NIC managed about 280 megabytes per second, whereas the Realtek NIC didn't quite reach that much. So the Intel NIC does seem to be a bit better than the Realtek NIC, at least for transferring files over the networking. For just gaming, I didn't really notice much of a difference. Okay, turns out the camera decided to not record the last part of this video, so I'll have to do it again. And to do that, I had to take a shower, set up the camera, and recall what I was saying. So we have just finished the LAN test. Next is the Wi-Fi test. So this board comes with two different Wi-Fi chips. One is the Intel AX200, that's for the revision 1 boards, and the revision 1.1 boards get the MediaTek whatever, I can't remember the name, but it is Wi-Fi 6E capable, which means it also supports the 6 GHz band. If you have a router which also supports that, you can take advantage of it if you feel like it. For this test, I only did a transfer test to see what sort of a transfer speeds we could get, and I tested. I don't have an Intel AX200, but I do have an Intel AX210. And the Intel AX210 also supports Wi-Fi 6E, but I don't have Wi-Fi 6E capable router, so I haven't tested Wi-Fi 6E. But for these tests, we used the 5 GHz band on my girlfriend's computer and connected to the access point, which is on the other side of a wall, on the other side of her room. And so it's not too far away. It's like maybe 9 feet, 3 meters, and but there is a wall between the access point and the computer. The access point is a TP-Link EAP620, which is not capable of 160 megahertz channel width, but it is capable of 80, and it has 5 gigahertz. So my first test is with the access point. The second test is with this router. So this is a Huawei something, yeah, it doesn't matter. This Huawei router, which is Wi-Fi 6 capable, not 6E, just 6, but it does support 106 megahertz channel width. So we are going to test what sort of performance you would gain from if you had, if they supplied a Wi-Fi chip that had the capability to take advantage of 160 megahertz channel width. Anyway, on to the transfer test. So for the transfer test, the Intel AX210 managed mid-50s megabytes per second transfer speed, while the MediaTek chip managed mid-60s, I believe. So that was about 10 megabytes per second faster than the Intel chip, Wi-Fi chip, which surprised me a bit actually. Now, moving on to the test with the router. So for the results with the 160 megahertz channel width on the Huawei router, the Huawei router was connected to my switch and set up as an access point inside the room, while the other one was disabled. So, the results then. The Intel AX210 managed 90 to 100 megabytes per second, and that's not too bad, that's close to gigabit speeds. Whereas the MediaTek chip, that only managed about 80. So, well, it was a bit slower. But if you are connecting your motherboard to a Wi-Fi point, chances are you're not transferring a lot of files. You're only probably browsing the web and doing a bit of gaming. And chances are, if you are just gaming, you're not going to notice much of a difference. If you are gaming, you should use a cable to get the lowest latency possible. But I get the convenience by using the Wi-Fi router, of course. Now on to our conclusion. So in conclusion, the board is actually good, but it has some design faults, and because of those faults I can't really recommend it. The first problem is the debug LEDs, which is placed in such a stupid place. I can't believe they haven't caught this in testing. Maybe they don't test stuff like that. Probably just test for compatibility with memory modules. Speaking of which, that's the second fault of this motherboard, the failure to control the RGB on at least Corsair memory. I don't know if this problem is limited to Corsair memory or if it's also affecting G.Skill and Crucial Memory and other brands. I only have Corsair memory here, so I can't test the other ones, but that is also a pretty bad oversight on their part, I think. And of course, if you contact GIGABYTE support, they will probably tell you to contact Corsair support, and Corsair support will probably tell you to contact GIGABYTE support, and you'll probably end up in a loop of technical support that can't do anything to help you because, well, I don't know what the problem is, but clearly they don't either. So despite all of these issues, we will keep this board in my girlfriend's computer. We got it for the same price as NCXT B550 board, which technically would probably fit better in a white themed build, but the connectivity of the X570S Aero G is just so much better than the B550 from NCXT, so that's a pretty easy choice for us. And yeah, we will stick with this motherboard until it breaks or fails, even though AM5 is coming soon. But let's face it, AM5 is going to be very expensive, I think, personally, because first of all, you need DDR5 memory. DDR5 memory it's getting cheaper, but it's still more expensive than DDR4, and the cheap DDR5 memory is pretty bad and well, slow, and you can get good DDR4 for less. And the second thing is that the motherboards that support PCIe 5.0, they, well, we don't know the prices yet, but the rumors say they will be pretty pricey. So we don't really feel any regret going with a new AM4 motherboard and not waiting for an AM5 board, because, well, let's face it, the CPUs as well. The 6-core is probably going to be at least 300 USD, same as the 5600X, maybe even more. And there won't be any budget options until Intel releases a good competitor, which hopefully they do. We'll see. And yeah, so I do feel very comfortable going with an AM4 motherboard, even though it's end of life and stuff like that. So yeah. Thank you so much for watching. That's the end of this video, and farewell.